Are we waiting for one camera light or two camera lights? One. Okay. Welcome. Hello. This is Yoga Source, and I am Theresa Gagnon, your yoga guide, and I'd like to introduce you to an amazing being on this planet that will help us to dive that much more into our yoga practice, because as you know, as yoga is growing and growing exponentially, so are the, well, let's say the information out there about anatomy. And there's a lot of, like, I'm going to say it, anatomy busyness out there. And we want to get to the very nitty-gritty of the structure of the vessel and what we could do to provide our beings with much more healthier structural approaches to the yoga practice. So I'd like to introduce you to...
Hi, my name is Brandon Green. I am the owner of Strata Internal Performance, and I'm a certified muscle system specialist.
Isn't that awesome? So it's not like physiotherapy, chiropractic, it is a muscle, what do you call it again?
Muscle system specialist.
Muscle system, which is really important because it actually supports the bones and how we can move them eccentrically and concentrically. So I wanted to talk to Brandon about a lot of important poses, and one of them today is plank pose, and how we can make our plank pose or be in our plank pose more optimally. So let's get started, right? So what is plank pose? I'll show you. Okay, this is what we're gonna do. So in plank pose, you're gonna skedoodle your bum. Brandon sat down for the first time in a bolster in a long time. Anyways, no. So in plank pose, and it's just like a push-up, just like what anybody does in a gym. So plank pose is here, that's it, boom. And then I find a lot of people are doing this, and they're doing this, or they're doing this, and they're doing all kinds of things. So what happens is, in a classroom sitting setting, that the majority of people do not, I know you can laugh at me all you want. The majority of people don't understand what they're doing to hold themselves up, period. And that's where the injuries occur. First here, maybe not first or second, and in the lumbar spine. So what can we talk about?
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, and what's really hard is that we have all of these yoga poses and exercises that we've predefined. So you hear the word plank, and suddenly the word plank means a series of positions and motions, and you have to be able to sustain those positions. I mean, the first thing I think that we should talk about, even just for a quick second, is how different each one of you are. Is that Theresa demonstrated this plank, and you did an amazing job. But if you came in and you were the exact same Theresa, but you were 1.5 feet taller, the force and torque requirements on Theresa would be a huge, huge difference. And if Theresa was the same strength and she was only 4 feet tall and short, the torque would be far less.
I never thought of it that way. That's awesome.
Right? Like,
okay.
So come back into that plank position just for a second. Right? So if we're just looking at Theresa in this plank position, you can see that where her hands are and where her foot are kind of like the support beams of this bridge. And in between is this long piece of the bridge that has to stay in this position for her to support this, which has muscular requirements here, and in her legs, and across her shoulder blades. Now imagine she was this much longer, 1.5 feet.
I wish I was.
Here, you can come back down to being seated. I mean, imagine if she was that much longer, the body has to work that much harder.
Never thought of it that way.
It makes it tough.
Okay, and so that's why you see a lot of bodybuilders that are really amazing looking. They're a lot shorter, compact, aren't they?
Yeah, short people look really good. You guys short people can put muscle on better than the tall people.
That's true.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it makes it tough. But at the end of the day, when we're talking about these positions and the challenges with some of these positions, Theresa, what we're really talking about is torque. Because like you mentioned,
okay, back up. What is torque?
It's an awesome question.
Not like twerking.
Not twerking.
Twerking.
Torquing, right?
Okay, torque.
So torque, so we have this thing in physics called force. And force, the equation for force simply is mass times acceleration. So torque is force in a rotational environment. So when we have something like this, right, so we've got a joint, we've got a humerus and a scapula, and these two things together make a joint. When this thing moves around the joint surface, the contact surface, there's something called a joint axis that's created. And the joint axis has muscle, and what muscle does is it produces mechanical tension to help produce motion. The equation for torque is force times moment arm, and you could just imagine moment arm being distance. So why that's significant is much like what Theresa did. If you reach out like you just did, imagine Theresa had a weight in her hand. that weight, even if it was just, yeah, we got this weight in our hand, right?
Oh, wow.
Imagine how, like, right, you see how hard that is? Teresa, could you hold that for a long time?
For a few minutes.
What if you had that just right down
Seconds.
to your side, but you're hovering it just above the ground? A little easier down there, right?
Perhaps.
And if you were standing up and it was hanging like a suitcase, you could probably hold that for a long time.
Yes. Right.
The reason why you can hold a suitcase for an hour is because there's almost no torque. And when you're holding something out far, yeah, just like that. The line of force for Theresa is coming straight down through her shoulder, and there's almost, well, there's a low amount of torque, so low stress on her shoulder. But as soon as she brings it out, the distance gets further and further. And all of a sudden, the torque, especially at this position, is as large and as long as it possibly can get, which means it's the heaviest.
Yep.
So funny, Teresa, but I mean, if this thing weighs 5 pounds, is 5 pounds really 5 pounds?
No.
Because down here it's almost nothing.
Yes.
And up here it feels like 100 pounds.
Yes. Absolutely.
So when we're talking about a plank, what we have to really talk about is the requirements of all of these different joints.
Okay, should I go back into it? I can.
Let's go back into it. So Teresa, when you're teaching this, like if you guys at home are doing this, what's the hardest part for you? Teresa, what do you find to be the most difficult thing with your students with this?
Here, lumbar spine. I find that if they're not able to push away before they feel really weak, they do this and they let their hips dip, and or they compensate, and which is nice, they lift their hips up really high.
Yep.
And that's a down dog. So that's not the actual pose. So neither is this. So a lot of the energy, if they're not able to establish that foundation through the hands to the shoulder, then it's the lumbar spine that takes it.
And so true, because we've
Two
got that
places.
long bridge.
Yeah.
So then here's the question I'd like to ask, and you guys can ask yourself this, but a question to you. What is the plank for? As far as the body effects, what is the adaptation that you're looking for from the plank?
Okay, did you answer that? Core strength.
Core strength. Now, here's the challenge. If you can't do it and you don't have the core strength to even do the position, are you going to get any benefit?
And that's okay if you don't yet, and you will not benefit from it.
Now, I'll be honest, everyone here, I've actually taught educational material for yoga schools in the past. And one of the things I found to be a big limitation is getting past the predetermined positions associated with the name of a position, like a plank. Because if you tell someone to do a plank and change some of the joint positions, I don't know if you found this, Theresa, but some people just find that to be a red flag, like warning, do not do that because that's no longer yoga. Now you're getting into something else.
Oh, you're getting into, yes, that psychological way of thinking. It's unfortunate, but don't think that way. Please listen to us carefully. It's really important to take care of yourself. So modifications for that.
So let's give this a shot. So obviously, for anyone who's watching this, Theresa, you can do this. There's no problem. But let's pretend that you couldn't do it.
Okay.
So before we do that, go back into the plank position and let's just have a quick peek at it. Right, so this is normal plank. Now again, we talked about this boats go under bridges, this bridge thing, right? And we've got her hand, this lever here, joint axis here, long system, and then down to her feet. So the distance between her shoulders and her feet is probably about 5 feet, which if I put weight here is probably where she would break in her core if she couldn't sustain it or was weak enough, like you were talking about, arcing your back.
And then dropping the head.
Right. Now, there are 2 easy things that we could do to make this a little bit easier. First one, like you said, bring your hips up and walk your feet in a little bit. Now, let's exaggerate this. If she keeps walking in, so keep coming in, bring it in a few more inches, good. Now, this is a little crazy of a position, but at the end of the day, we still have all the same requirements of the midsection here. The legs are still doing something similar, and the distance between her feet and her hands is now closer to 4 feet. Go all the way back down there, Theresa. But some people, maybe in a yoga class, they may not feel comfortable doing a position like that. So another easy option, and for anyone watching this and you're like, I'm not doing that, that's for sissies. Give it a shot anyway if you can't do this. Go down onto your knees.
Oh, I love this pose.
Lift the feet up, slide your knees back just a little bit, and then pull your hips in a bit so you're still straight like you're doing come forward.
Oh,
there you
yes.
go. Yeah. Now we're ultimately still getting the same muscular recruitment in this midsection, but we've shortened the distance between here and here, so now the bridge is no longer 5 feet, it's now down to 3 feet, which means less torque.
Unbelievable.
Awesome.
And I'm still doing the same stuff, still working the core. And of course, that is, hello, epiphany, wake up. People, that's all you have to do is just modify and give yourself permission to grow from that place of support. Now, that was awesome. That's great information. But what I found too, no budding, no canceling that out, the wrists, the hands, the arms. So these two intersections, lumbar spine and arms.
Yeah, well, wrists are a big one, and I'm looking around because I was actually looking for a little device to try and manipulate this. Because for anyone who's watching, if you don't know who I am, besides from also being the owner of Strata, I'm also a professional drummer. And that means that my work as a manual hand-using muscle system specialist, someone who likes working out, someone who plays drums, and someone who is kind of tactile, I use my hands a lot. And as a young person, I developed something called ganglion cysts. Now, if you don't know what that is, that's at the back of the wrist. This cartilage starts to protrude out a little bit and restricts how much joint motion you have. So, Theresa, if you put your arm out and you bring your hand back like so, right, you guys can see that Theresa's got 90 degrees of wrist extension here. Now, I'm quote unquote healthy, but if I do the exact same thing, my wrists only come back to about 70, little less on my right side, which means that if I were going to do a plank and I had the same position, that my wrist is being forced into further extension, which is where we start to get injured. The role of our muscles is really to help control motion and absorb force. And if our muscles can't do it, which this is what this is, active range of motion, this is my muscles pulling me here. Once I go past what my muscles can control, now I'm getting into the place where my joint's taking the force.
And strain,
this,
yes. Okay.
yeah, and this is how you get injured. Now, just let's pretend that you had my bad wrists and you had that limited motion, because Theresa's got a fantastic wrist, not a problem, but some of you might be like me and have these crummy wrists. Maybe you're drummers. Rock on.
Rock on!
Now, I don't know if we've got something here that we could use.
How about you're looking for a lip?
I'll have something to pick up
So
your
what we
wrists.
do is, in the yoga practice, is in cases like that, you take the front edge of your mat when you're in a plank position and you fold it. Or you can have other pieces of yoga mat and you could cut them out constructively and create a plank for your wrists. And that's what we've done in the past. So
Nice.
if that were the case, as Brandon's speaking, you could roll your mat to the point where you have a lip. Is that what you're looking for?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So let's get you in that position. So again, if you're like me and you only have this much, you need to fill the void on your palms. You can maintain this wrist angle so your joints don't take the forces. So if Theresa demonstrates.
So again, as you mentioned, if my wrist can go down at the 90, but if I'm not able to, I'm up here, then taking that ramp and placing it right at the base knuckle of the index finger and the thumb base knuckle perhaps, that's where we go so far.
Yeah.
So maybe you can elaborate if that's, oh, that feels so good though. Even with a 90-degree wrist bend, this feels really amazing.
Yeah, and honestly, if anyone's interested in just having, like maybe you have great wrist motion like Theresa, but you just want a more comfortable experience. I mean, at the end of the day, even if Theresa has come forward like you were, even if she's got that 90 degrees there, sometimes it's not comfortable hanging out in the extreme of a joint motion. So just coming back a little bit and hanging out there with this angle here is more comfortable. So yeah, I mean, that's simply it, is your joints are not taking all the force of you.
Okay,
Which
so
makes a big difference.
that made a huge difference. And at the other offering that we offer in the yoga practice is that it's not a pushing down through the palm of the hand, it's more of a suction cup. So we plant down through the base knuckle and the base knuckle of the thumb and pinky finger and the index knuckle. So you create this suction cup. So you're literally pressing down in those areas through the finger pads, and that creates more strength up through the form. Apparently, so I just want to reiterate that if that index knuckle comes up and you're flattening your hands, that creates a lean to the wrist, which is the weakest placement of your wrist. Is the pinky
So
side.
on the exact same note of this, say that, because Theresa made a great point, that she's talking about having your hands kind of cupping the ground, which makes the middle of your hand work a lot more. Now, some of you also may not have the strength to do that. Like if you're someone who is heavier, like say, not necessarily even overweight, but maybe you're a football player, you weigh 300 pounds, strong person, you just can't, you don't have the finger strength. Going back to the exact same example, what you can do is instead of putting your hand over the mat, you can put your hand on the corner of the mat to fill that cup there. So that way you have the exact same cupping effect that Theresa's talking about. The wrist is not taking too much force. And what you were talking about is ulnar deviation. So it's actually compressing the ulna on the side of the fifth hand.
I love that languaging. Okay, yes.
And so there's less force into the extremes of joint motion.
So there you have so many options to guide yourself in your practice in the most healthful way. And yes, it does take a practice, and it does take educators such as Brendan and myself to help you to have a much better practice when you're choosing to use, yoga as your practice.
If I had one thing that I'd say in closing, kind of leading into the end of this segment, really would be that I think it's important to remember that everyone who's watching this is unique. And I think we get hung up and we look at Theresa and go, wow, Theresa can do it, I have to do it the exact same way. And Theresa's built different than you, and if Theresa had two twin sisters that had lived slightly different lives, they'd all be slightly different too. You're unique, and you have to respect that and modify your yoga positions and whatever it is you're doing to be for you. And if it's not for you and you're doing Theresa's version of a plank, you're gonna get hurt. I could not do a Theresa version of a plank, but I could do a Brandon version, Brandon's plank. So remember.
Let's see what that looks like, Brandon. So just remember that this practice is a group practice. Yes, we are all collectively practicing yoga in a yoga space. But reminding yourself to really listen and to ask the questions before and after class to enhance your library of information, because we're here to support you, as always.
So if you're watching, I mean, if I were gonna do a plank, again, the thing that's really different for me is my wrists. So I would do exactly what Theresa demonstrated. Except, to be honest, she folded it 4 times, I'd fold it even a bit more, just to really protect my wrist.
And again, you can also create that yoga mat structure by cutting up old yoga mats and creating that for your knees and your wrists.
See? Brandon's plank, Theresa's plank.
Thank you very much for joining us in this new segment of educating yourself and becoming really authentic in your practice and knowing yourself and growing to know yourself even more, physically, mentally, and spiritually. Thanks so much, Brandon. I can't wait to do more of this. So stay tuned for more wonderful, well, what are we going to call this? Wonderful information on the flip side of the inside. It really is going to be great working with you.
Work in progress, but enjoy. Remember, you're unique.
Namaste.